I'm joined today by Lawrence Mishel, president of the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. Very interesting recent paper from EPI, Productivity and a Typical Worker's Pay, Why It Matters and Why it's Real. Larry, this is such an interesting topic. And, when we talk about wages, there's often a number of indicators used as sort of benchmarks that we can compare wages to. A common one when talking about the minimum wage is inflation. Sometimes, though, we hear about how the minimum wage has shifted in correlation to, or sometimes not, productivity. And you've pointed out that with regard to wage inequality, productivity is actually a very important factor to look at. Let's start there. Why is it such an important indicator?
Well, let's start with the basic facts as you laid them out, which is that um, compensation for a typical worker has been stagnant for most of the last 40 years, since 1973 or 1979. And when I'm saying that, I'm reflecting both all the wages and all the benefits that people get. And when I say typical worker, I mean one of two measures we've used, one that encompasses the wages of basically the bottom 80% of the workforce, and another which is the median worker, which is the worker right in the middle of the pack, someone who makes more than half the workforce and less than half the workforce. So those measures of compensation grew a total of 9% over that period of time, which is about 0.2% a year. That's why we call it stagnant. And the only period of really robust growth of wages and benefits was in the late 1990s. So, as you point out, we do compare this to productivity. And what is that? Uh, Productivity is the output of goods and services per hour worked. It's really what each worker is creating per hour that they work. And that is the basis of the way we grow the economic pie. So the point that we make in the paper is that this productivity, technically net of depreciation of all the capital, grew about 72% since 1973, but the hourly compensation of a typical worker grew about 9%. And what does that mean? That means that there was a lot of income, wealth, and wages produced by the economy. It just didn't get to most people. And that's really important to understand because many people feel like we have a bad economy and that's why things haven't gone so well. Well, the fact is, it wasn't because the economy didn't produce enough. It's because the economy has been restructured in a way that most people just don't get much of the benefit of the productivity that they themselves produced. And why is that? And that gets to your point. It's primarily inequality. It's
Right. And I want to get to, if we can take it in a sort of a few steps, I would love to get to how this understanding should impact how we read employment numbers that we get every month. But let me hold off on that for a second. So
Okay.
if we had a situation, Larry, where we saw this same very, sub 1% per year wage growth, but we also saw a lack of productivity growth, we could actually say, listen, the problem is being caused by the fact that we're just not producing that much. It is a broader economic downturn, and as such, wage growth is stagnant as well. But what you're saying is very different, which is that wages have not been going up very much. Productivity has, and the sort of excess productivity above the wage increase has been going up towards the richest, the big corporations and the richest within those corporations.
That's essentially it. That you can complain at various times that we have productivity which should be better, and we're not saying that economic policy shouldn't focus on how to raise productivity, but we are pointing out that the productivity we have, we think you would expect it to be associated with much broader increase in living standards for the vast majority and wages. And the beneficiaries of the productivity are those who receive income from wealth, capital income, basically profits, dividends, etc., and the very highest earners, those in the top 1%, top 5%, top 10% of wage earners. And so the vast majority has not seen the growth.
So, in the last several years, while President Obama has been president, we've seen some recurring talking points from those who wish to criticize President Obama in terms of the jobs created. And a couple of the popular ones are, number one, whatever number of jobs are being created, wages are not going up. And that is President Obama's fault, and it's an indicator of a bad economy. The other popular one is, well, jobs are being created, but they're bad jobs as measured by the salaries that these jobs pay. Now, we've already debunked the later one. In reality, the proportion of low, middle, and high income jobs created during the Obama presidency basically mirrors those same proportions that we've seen over the last several decades. I want to go to the first one, though. When we hear that jobs are being created, but wages are not increasing, and thus that is a sign of a bad economy, is it not completely ignoring that those jobs are creating significant additional wealth? It's just that the workers creating the wealth aren't the recipients of said wealth.
Well, I think we have to, I think those are some good points. I think we should acknowledge that the period since 2007, which predates President Obama, have been one of a really substantial recession, which has really, done great damage to jobs and incomes. But I think the frame that says something to do with President Obama is a little bit bizarre because, of course, he wasn't present or anyway responsible for the Great Recession. I think it's also important to note that wages have been stagnant for college graduates and high school graduates, blue-collar workers and white-collar workers for a long time, at least since 2002. So the last recovery, the business cycle that went from 2000 to 2007, which was based on George Bush's watch, in that recovery, wages didn't grow at all relative to inflation. So this is something that really predates President Obama. It's something that was present under President Reagan from 1979 to 1995. And so this is a long-standing problem. And I don't think it's a critique of President Obama's policies, but it is a critique of the kind of economy that we have now. And I think what's interesting at this moment of time is that you find both Democrats and Republicans talking about wage stagnation. And I think we should have a robust conversation in this country about what we can do to actually get wages to rise robustly for everybody. I think some ideas are good and some are not. The main point of this paper, one of the main takeaways about showing the divergence between productivity and the growth of wages and benefits for the typical worker, is that you can't say like frankly, what Jeb Bush did last night. Let's have 4% growth. Now, I don't think his policies are going to get us to 4% growth, but the fact is, excuse me, if you get growth, which just basically means creating jobs and productivity, does not mean you're actually going to raise wages. That there has to be policies which reconnect the growth of wages for the vast majority and growth of productivity and growth more generally. And that's the major takeaway. Better growth is good, more jobs is good, but we have to actually reconnect wages to growth. How do you do that? Well, a much higher minimum wage, restoring collective bargaining, doing things like what President Obama is doing in revising overtime so many more people are eligible for overtime pay, making undocumented workers eligible for citizenship so that they are not exploited, so that they earn more money.
All right. I think we may have lost Lawrence Mishel. We were about to wrap up. The paper is Productivity and a Typical Worker's Pay, the Economic Policy Institute. We were speaking with economist Lawrence Mishel. Thanks to him for joining us. He did lose his connection just as we were about to wrap up. Fortunately, it didn't happen after the first 3 minutes. We will take a break and be back with plenty more after this.